President Trump has dramatically escalated his confrontation with New York City following Zohran Mamdani's mayoral victory, moving beyond rhetorical attacks to concrete threats of withholding federal funding that could devastate the city's budget and cripple essential services, ranging from transportation infrastructure to public housing to education programs that depend heavily on billions in annual federal support. The president's threats represent an unprecedented assertion of executive power to punish a municipality for its electoral choices and policy position, raising profound constitutional questions about whether a president can legally use control over federal purse strings to retaliate against cities whose voters rejected his preferred candidates and whose incoming leadership promises active resistance to administration priorities on immigration, policing, and social programs. The legal framework governing federal funding to cities involves complex interactions between Congressional Appropriations Authority, executive discretion over implementation timing and condition, and various statutes protecting state and local governments from arbitrary federal interference in their internal affairs. Trump's legal team has identified provisions they claim authorize the president to attach conditions to federal grants, delay disbursements pending compliance review, and restructure funding streams in ways that could substantially reduce resources flowing to New York without technically violating prohibitions against withholding congressionally appropriated funds. These arguments rest on aggressive interpretations of executive authority that previous administrations generally avoided asserting so broadly. But Trump's willingness to test legal boundaries and endure adverse court rulings while appealing creates practical leverage even if his ultimate legal position proves untenable in final judicial resolution. New York City's fiscal dependence on federal support makes it particularly vulnerable to presidential pressure despite its economic power and political importance, as the municipal budget incorporates approximately $15 billion in annual federal funding across dozens of programs addressing transportation, housing, education, social services, and public health. Sudden loss or substantial reduction of this funding would force either massive service cuts affecting millions of residents or dramatic tax increases that could accelerate the business and population flight that Trump explicitly hopes to trigger through his threats. Mayor-elect Mamdani has promised to resist federal blackmail and maintain progressive policies regardless of funding consequences. But the practical reality of governing requires money that the city cannot easily replace from local sources if Trump follows through on blocking federal transfer. The immediate trigger for Trump's escalated threats appears to be Mamdani's confrontational victory speech, directly challenging the president and promising that New York would become a sanctuary protecting immigrants, expanding social programs, and actively resisting federal policy the new mayor characterizes as cruel and unconstitutional. Trump's volatile personality and extreme sensitivity to perceived disrespect makes him particularly reactive to such public defiance, transforming what might have remained a routine, tense relationship between opposing politicians into a personal vendetta, where the president seems determined to demonstrate his power to inflict pain on adversaries, regardless of collateral damage to innocent residents caught in the crossfire. White House insiders describe Trump as obsessed with the New York situation and demanding that staff develop maximum pressure tactics to ensure Mamdani's administration fails spectacularly, as an example to other cities considering progressive leadership. Congressional Democrats immediately denounced Trump's threats as unconstitutional abuse of power that violates fundamental principles of federalism and equal treatment, announcing investigations and preparing legislation explicitly prohibiting presidents from withholding funds from cities based on political disagreements or policy differences. These congressional responses face obvious obstacles given Republican control of the House and the practical difficulty of constraining executive discretion over spending implementation through legislation that must itself be enforced by executive branch agencies controlled by the president. Democrats are trying to restrain the limitations of congressional authority to effectively check presidential abuse of spending power expose troubling gaps in the constitutional structure that the founders apparently did not anticipate when designing separation of powers mechanism. Republican reactions reveal deep divisions within the party between those who enthusiastically support Trump's confrontational approach toward liberal cities, and those who worry about precedents being established and constitutional principles being violated in ways that could later be used against Republican jurisdictions by future Democratic presidents. Several Republican senators with backgrounds in constitutional law privately expressed concern that Trump's threats exceed legitimate executive authority and establish dangerous precedents. But these reservations remained largely private, as public statements emphasized support for holding sanctuary cities accountable and protecting federal immigration enforcement from local obstruction. The gap between private constitutional concerns and public partisan support reflects the degree to which short-term political considerations override institutional principles when party loyalty conflicts with constitutional fidelity. Mayor-elect Zoran Mamdani has assembled a crisis response team of constitutional lawyers, budget experts, and federal grants specialists to prepare for the possibility that Trump will actually implement his threats to block funding, with contingency planning involving potential legal challenge, alternative revenue sources, service prioritization protocol, and public communication strategies designed to ensure that any resulting hardships are clearly attributed to presidential vindictiveness rather than municipal mismanagement. The transition team recognizes that the next several months will test whether progressive urban governance can survive determined federal opposition, with outcomes likely influencing similar efforts in other major cities where candidates aligned with Mamdani's political vision are considering mayoral campaign. The legal strategy being developed involves immediate litigation, seeking preliminary injunctions against any funding cutoff, while arguing that presidential retaliation for political speech and electoral outcomes violates First Amendment protections and equal protection guarantees that prohibit government from discriminating against jurisdictions based on their policy choices or political leadership. These constitutional claims face uncertain prospects given the current Supreme Court's general deference to executive authority and skepticism of judicial intervention in political disputes between branches and levels of government. But Mamdani's lawyers believe they can demonstrate such clear violations of fundamental rights that even conservative judges will feel compelled to constrain presidential overreach. The litigation strategy also involves coordinating with other sanctuary cities and progressive jurisdictions that could face similar federal retaliation, creating the possibility of nationwide legal challenge that might carry more weight than New York fighting alone. City budget officials are conducting detailed analyses of which programs and services would be most immediately affected by various scenarios of federal funding reduction, identifying areas where cuts would be least damaging, and developing contingency plans for maintaining essential operation through reallocation of local resources and potential emergency borrowing. These preparations acknowledge the harsh reality that despite its enormous wealth and economic power, New York cannot easily replace billions in federal funding without either severe service reductions or substantial tax increases that could prove economically and politically unsustainable. The budget crisis that Trump threatens to impose would force Mamdani to make agonizing choices between campaign promises and fiscal reality, potentially vindicating conservative predictions that progressive governance collapses when confronted with genuine resource constraints. Public opinion polls show New York voters deeply divided about the confrontation with Trump, with progressive residents rallying behind Mamdani and viewing the conflict as a necessary resistance to federal overreach, while more moderate and conservative New Yorkers express concern about the costs of sustained confrontation and question whether the new mayor's confrontational approach serves the city's interest. This division creates political vulnerability that Trump clearly hopes to exploit by ensuring that the consequences of resistance become so painful that public pressure forces Mamdani to either capitulate to federal demand or face electoral backlash from residents tired of being collateral damage in an ideological battle. The political calculation involves whether Mamdani can maintain popular support if federal funding cutoffs produce tangible service deterioration, and whether he can successfully frame these consequences as Trump's fault rather than his own. Business leaders in New York face complicated decisions about how to position themselves in the federal-municipal conflict, recognizing that taking sides risks antagonizing either the federal administration that controls regulatory agencies affecting their operations or the local government that influences their day-to-day business environment and workforce. Some major corporations have quietly reached out to the Trump administration, seeking assurances that they will not face federal retaliation if they maintain or expand New York operations, despite the president's campaign to portray the city as descending into chaos under socialist governance, while others are genuinely reconsidering expansion plans and evaluating alternative locations in Republican-led states where they would face less regulatory burden and political uncertainty. The economic consequences of sustained federal-local warfare could prove severe regardless of which side ultimately prevails in legal and political battles. State government involvement adds another layer of complexity, as New York governor faces pressure to intervene on behalf of the city, while managing her own relationship with federal authorities and competing political consideration, including potential presidential ambition that might be damaged by too close an association with an explicitly socialist mayor, facing the full weight of Trump administration opposition. The governor possesses certain authorities that could buffer the city from federal pressure, including potential state funding supplements and legal support through the state attorney general's office. But using these tools requires political calculations about how aggressively to align with Mamdani against Trump, when the governor's own political future may depend on maintaining viability beyond New York's progressive base. The tension between state and local interests reflects broader challenges facing Democratic politicians trying to navigate between progressive activists demanding confrontation and moderate voters preferring pragmatic accommodation. The situation's resolution remains highly uncertain, with scenarios ranging from Trump backing down when faced with legal and political obstacles to actually implementing funding cutoffs that trigger economic crisis and potential humanitarian emergency in America's largest city. The precedent established will inevitably influence how future presidents approach relationships with opposition jurisdictions and whether federal funding becomes routinely weaponized as political leverage rather than distributed according to statutory formulas and neutral criteria. The normalization of presidential retaliation against cities for their electoral choices and policy positions would represent a fundamental shift in American federalism, with potentially devastating consequences for local democracy and the ability of diverse communities to pursue their own visions of good governance without fear of federal punishment for deviating from presidential preference.